remarks isn't here, I'm going to give a brief comment and try to sum up a little bit. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for discussion. Our first speaker is Harriet Jackson, who also is obviously one of the co-organizers. And actually, this conference was really Harriet's idea. So we really thank her for... Harriet Jackson received her Master's of Philosophy degree from NYU, and she also spent a year studying at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Her MA thesis dealt with the topic of the rise of anti-Semitism in France in the 30s, and she's also published an essay on the impact of the First World War on social security in France. She spent most of her career working in publishing, and she worked here at Columbia for several years on a project called the Electronic Publishing Initiative. More recently, she spent time working at EVO here in New York City, the Institute of East European Jewish Studies. There she helped to catalog some of the collections that they had not yet cataloged on French Jewish history during the Holocaust. Here she came across the papers of Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, who founded l'Association des Israélites Pratiquants in Paris in 1936. And finally, and her talk today is going to be based on the archival documents she discovered while working at EVO, in addition, I think, to some other documentation. And the title of her talk today is, "What's a Hasidic Rabbi Like You Doing in a Place Like This?"
Okay, well, I'm here to talk about a fascinating character. And to tell you the truth, when Yivo hired me to work on the papers of a Hasidic rabbi, I thought, how boring could that be? And he is one of the most interesting people I have ever studied. And what impressed me immediately was when I learned that as soon as he came to Paris from the Soviet Union, within a few months, he established a philanthropy, a social service agency for practicing Jews called the Association des Israélites Pratiquants. And I thought, you know, the first time I went to Paris, I could figure out which boulangerie to go to, you know, in the first 6 months. So I was really impressed with him. So the second thing that I have to say is, some people think that when I speak about Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, that I'm talking about the leader of the Lubavitcher Hasidic sect, what is Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who's called the Rebbe. I'm not talking about him, and I am also not talking about Isaac Schneerson, who founded the CDJC Research Center in Paris. However, all three Schneersons were cousins, distant cousins, so they were related. And as Vicki told you, this research is based on Yivo, but I did an exhaustive study at the Joint, and this is also based on some oral testimony. Now, the story of Rabbi Schneerson's wartime activities raises some important historiographical questions about resistance and rescue in Vichy France, and in particular about the role played by Jewish individuals and organizations. His story is compelling because the choices that he faced and the strategies he adopted help us understand the limits, the limited range of choices, dilemmas, and strategies faced by rescuers of Jews in Vichy France. So there is something remarkably different that sets Rabbi Schneerson's story apart from that of any other Jewish leader, lay or religious. And what distinguishes him from the others are two major influences. First, his religious observance. He was Hasidic. His religious observance informed his decisions. We cannot understand the man without being familiar with Judaism and Judaic law. Second, and this is really important, His clandestine experience as a Hasidic Jew in Soviet Russia also informed the clandestine work that he undertook in Vichy. In other words, he came to France with prior resistance training. So in today's presentation, I would like to focus on 5 historiographical questions that are raised by Rabbi Schneerson's story. And again, his story helps us understand the larger story of relief, rescue, and resistance. Take out your notebooks, your pens, there'll be a quiz. And I just want to show you some photographs of Rabbi Schneerson. So Rabbi Schneerson is to the left. He's with a friend. Next one. Rabbi Schneerson again is on the left, and this is a ceremony with the Joint and some American U.S. Army chaplains right after the war. This is Hadassah Kalbach, the daughter of Rabbi Schneerson, and when she was a teenager in Weill, she hid one of the small groups of children. And if you fast forward 60, 70 years forward, you'll see that she is right here in the auditorium. And I'd like to introduce you to Hadassah Kalbach. Schneerson, the wife of Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, and she's really very important, and I wish I could find out more about her because she was instrumental in helping her husband, as was Hadassah, in performing research, performing rescue. That's a Freudian slip. Okay, so the next one. Oh, okay, so this is Schollenberg, Hadassah's younger brother, so he must have been about 6 or 8. She's standing next to him, but she...
This was in Israel.
Oh, it's in Israel?
This one is in 1935 in Israel, this picture was
okay. He had to leave the Soviet Union because he was doing a lot of clandestine activity in the 1920s and the 1930s. And, yes, I'll get to that. And, so again, clandestine activities, you weren't allowed to practice Judaism. He was circulating American currency that he got from the Joint, and that alone would have earned him the death penalty. The secret police came to visit their house on many occasions, surprise visits, and Hadassah said that her father could always talk himself out of an arrest. He was just always calm, and he knew how to pretend that he wasn't a rabbi, that he didn't have Judaic books, and that I think he was like a tailor. He pretended he was a tailor. Anyhow, he had to leave in...
Photographer also.
Oh, photographer, okay. And so by 1935, it was clear that he had to leave, that his life was at risk. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe at the time suggested that he go to Palestine, British Palestine. So he went with the family in 1935. He disliked it very much. It seemed too communist for him. So he went back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was in Poland at the time, so this is still 1935, and he said, I don't like this Palestine, thing. Can you send me somewhere else? And he was sent to Paris. So he arrives in Paris, actually 1935, and his family joins him in 1936. And then again, within a few months of his arrival in Paris, he sets up this association. And what does this association do? Between 1936 and 1940, it sets up Hebrew schools, at least 2 synagogues, and at least 2 soup kitchens. And these activities are funded by the Joint. And this is very important because the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee had been a major funder, if not the major funder of Jewish organizations in Europe. So, I'm back to my 5 historiographical questions. And the first thing that I would like to ask is, or think about, we know that foreign Jews were particularly targeted by Vichy from the beginning of the occupation. And they faced enormous obstacles just to survive. Practically 1 out of every 2 foreign Jews perished as a result of Vichy's role in the Holocaust. How was Rabbi Schneerson able not only to survive the entire war, but to also perform relief and rescue for so many co-religionists? 2, did relief organizations help perpetuate the system of internment and labor camps? And can they be considered collaborationists? 3, what strategies did Jewish organizations such as Schneerson's, what did they do to adopt to survive? And what constraints did they face as the circumstances of the war and the nature of collaboration changed from 1940 to 1944? If there's anything that we learned here at the conference, is the changing circumstances of the war in France in 1940 was completely different from France in November 1944, and again, completely different than September 1943. 4th question, are you writing? What was the nature of the Vichy government at the local level? How were people like Rabbi Schneerson able to obtain help from local Vichy officials? And 5, when is, and this is one of the most important themes of the conference, when is rescue considered rescue? When does rescue count, and who decides? It is not up to historians to judge, but I will apply to historians' tools to understand the motives and achievements of one man, and then situate his story of resistance in the larger story of Vichy France. I'll skip the part about his coming from an illustrious family in Russia, that he was involved in clandestine activities and then came to Paris. I'll just start immediately with the war. So within days of the French defeat, major Jewish organizations fled Paris. They set up new headquarters in the Jewish quarter of Marcel. So some of these Jewish organizations are Hayas, the Hebrew Immigrant, the Aid Society, the Joint, again, his Association des Israélites Pratiquants, which I'll just refer to with its acronym AIP, and CAR, which later sort of turned into USHIF. They were all located in this area of Marseille. These Jewish organizations, while in Paris, had forged important relationships before the war to help Jewish refugees. And these relationships, even under stress, under wartime conditions, continued. And the Joint remained their principal benefactor throughout the war years. As a matter of fact, the Joint financed the AIP's activities throughout the war up to about 50%. So these Jewish organizations were faced with the incredible problem of what to do with the refugees. During the first winter, 1940-41, during the first winter, there were tens of thousands of foreign Jews incarcerated in Vichy's internment camps, and hundreds were dying from horrific living conditions. So they felt they had to do something. So they sent, there were many things that they did, which you heard about during the conference, and specifically the AIP, Rabbi Schneerson, sent care packages, 500 to 800 per month. And for a small organization, a one-man operation, 500 to 800 care packages is a lot. He also tried to release some of the interned Jews by either helping them emigrate, find jobs, or enrolling them in the vocational schools that Schneerson set up in Marseille. And the Ort helped him set up one of them. Now, in addition, Rabbi Schneerson, in addition to providing relief, Rabbi Schneerson ran a communal home for children of practicing Jews. And he had to move the home several times during the war as conditions became more dangerous. So he set up the first children's home outside of Vichy, and he set this up with the Osé. That partnership didn't last long, and I have a feeling that he was his own boss, and he only reported to himself and then God. And so it was short-lived, and within a few months, he set up another home in Marseille, which existed there from October 1940 until November 1942, when the Germans occupied the zone non occupée. What's really interesting is that within 2 or 3 days of the German invasion, he was able to get all of the children, there were about 60 at the time, his staff, which must have been at least 5, and his family, 4. So we're talking about a group of 70 people. He was able to get them out of Marseille and safely to a town called Demeux, which is not far from Toulouse. And what's amazing is that he was able to get travel passes for everyone, which is something that was very difficult to do during the war, but he had connections at the Préfecture. Now, fast forward, he's in Demeux for a few months. The American Quakers and the Red Cross helped him, set up, provide some supplies, some blankets. But a few months later, in March, he was tipped off that it wasn't really safe. And so in March, actually the day after Purim, he again moved everyone to Voiron. And in March 1943, as you know, Voiron was safe because it was under Italian jurisdiction. So the Jews there were safe from deportation. So that was, a smart move to go to Voiron. As you know, September 1943, with the the Italian army surrendering to the Allies, the Jews in the Italian sector were understandably worried and wanted to follow the Italian army into Italy, and most of them, thousands, got stuck in Nice, and they got stuck because the Gestapo organized a huge roundup, and so the Schneersons, the children, the staff were entrapped there for 2 or 3 weeks. And what's really interesting is that Leon Poliakov, who you've heard of, Leon Poliakov is a historian of anti-Semitism. During the war years, during 1941 and 1942, he was the right-hand man of Rabbi Schneerson. And in his memoirs, in Polyakov's memoirs, he writes about the rabbi and how he was always on 24/7. He had this incredible energy. The one negative portrayal is that Leon Poliakov was a secular Jew, and he couldn't understand someone being religious, let alone Orthodox. So he just thought it was really peculiar when he would be doing his office work, and then Rabbi Schneerson would sort of like pull him in, like, we need a minion. So Poliakov had a hard time with that. So the first question is, how did Schneerson? Here he is. He's foreign. He's an outsider. He's not part of some of the French religious organizations, such as one, for example, is the Aumôniers. The Aumôniers are the Vichy appointed chaplains, like army chaplains, and they were permitted to go into the camps, and they and other kinds of secular or other religious social welfare organizations tried to provide relief for the interned. And we saw this in Pierre Sauvage's film last night. there's one occasion, and this might sound frivolous to you, but there's one occasion, two occasions, 1941 and 1942. You can get next. Oh, this is one of the children's home, and next one, again, just another photo, and this is yet another children's home. You can see he had them set up in nice real estate. And the next one, here we have, these are images that I got from the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C., and it shows religious Jews performing Shabbat during the weekend, and so you can see they need prayer shawls and okay. Ooh, I better speak through. So Rabbi Schneerson and the Aumônier made sure that not only did they have food, but they had the ritual items. And okay, on the question of whether or not, or I should say that there are two historians, Jacques Adler and Adam Reisky, who think that, they believe that the organizations that helped provide relief to the internees were actually perpetuating the camp system, because they were not resisting Vichy, they were actually submitting themselves to Vichy. Historians like Susan Zuccotti and Vicki Caron, however, argue that it's really unfair to accuse these organizations before September 1942 of knowing of the final solution, of knowing that the internment camps would ultimately be used for extermination. The third issue I raise is, again, this, the question of complicity, and that is the Germans, it's the Hannah Arendt thesis about the Judenrat, and there are some people or historians who think that the Yeshiv, which was an umbrella organization that was imposed by the Germans on the French, some consider this umbrella organization as being likened to the Judenrat in the ghettos in the East. But I don't see it that way. And I see I don't have time to explain why. Okay. One point that I do want to make is, and we made it became clear at the conference that that the summer of 1942, when the massive deportations started, that this was a turning point for Jewish organizations when they realized this is it. We have to go underground. We have to get involved in clandestine activities. And what I want to say is that Schneerson was a little bit more savvy than the others and earlier. So, for example, in 1941, in Marseille, he was already involved in manufacturing false papers. And Joseph Bass, who Susan Zuccotti spoke about this morning, who headed the rescue network, Réseau, the Service Andrée, he actually, Joseph Bass, came to Schneerson asking for help. And it's Leon Polyakov who writes about this. And then there are some other savvy things that he did before this turning point. And what I would like to argue is that because of his resistance experience in the Soviet Union, he wasn't duped, and he knew how to manipulate the bureaucracy. And whereas one could say that the French Jewish leaders, like Brenner and Lambert, up until a certain point, hoped that Vichy could somehow offer some kind of buffer between the Jewish community and the Germans, that illusion completely disappeared by the time of the deportations in 1942. And I think that Schneerson was onto that earlier, because he started the clandestine activities in 1941. There's, do I have a few minutes? Okay. There's something that's very important, and it's something that bothers me because there's very limited work on Schneerson in the historiography. There are about 3 historians who have written serious books about relief, and they have included information about Schneerson. There's some other historians who are a little bit harsh and blame him for a Gestapo roundup that occurred on March 23rd, 1944. And the criticism is that Schneerson didn't disperse the children earlier. And so what I would like to point out again is the limitations that they were working under. And as a matter of fact, Schneerson started out with about 60 children when he left Nice, after the Gestapo, roundup. He left Nice, actually thanks to the service Andrée, and he was able to bring everyone back to Voiron. So about 60 children, the staff, and the family. And at that point, September 1943, they go underground. They hide, and the children aren't allowed to be seen, and they're not allowed to, come out of the house. And it was Hadassah, as a teenager, who and a few of her father's yeshiva boys, they went on their bicycles and provided communications, provided medicine between all of these hiding places. And so what I'd like to point out is that, in fact, between September and March 1944, all of the children had been smuggled across to Switzerland, and Schneerson was involved in a rescue network that was involved with Mandel, who's responsible for trying to rescue Hungarian Jews. And it's tragic that the 18 children who had been arrested by the Gestapo at La Martyrière, at this home, it's tragic that they were found out. Someone apparently had denounced them, but they were slated to be smuggled across the Swiss border a few days later. And the documentation about that is having to do with certificates that I don't have the time to go into, and also correspondence between Schneerson and a French lawyer, Mathieu Moulin, with whom they had a close relationship when they were in Marseille in 1942, because both of these men headed Orthodox Jewish organizations, and Mathieu Moulin had to escape to Switzerland after the Germans invaded in November 1942, and then Mathieu Moulin worked very closely with Mandel, who was a Hungarian Jew who was creating certificates, false papers to try to help the children get smuggled across to Switzerland. And so we do know that some of Schneerson's children made it to Switzerland. And I guess I will conclude by saying that the fact that there was this tragedy seems to trump all his other activities, such as performing relief and, in fact, rescuing at least 40 others. And between 1940 and 1944, there were hundreds of children who had passed through his home. Maybe they stayed for a few months, maybe they stayed for a year. And I know that Mordechai Paldiel had visited the home, I think, one summer for a very short time. In Marseille. And Bertha Schwartz was hidden by Schneerson. And as a matter of fact, right after the summer deportations, it became clear to Schneerson that the Jews in Marseille, had to be rescued, as quick as possible. The children had to be smuggled out. And actually, a few days before Bertha and her sisters were slated for deportation to Drancy, Schneerson sent his yeshiva boys to, pick her up, and her sisters. So if you'd like to stand, this is a hidden child. Proof. Thank you. And so I'd like to conclude by saying that the achievements of Rabbi Schneerson define the prevalent image of the Jew, and particularly the image of the religious Jew as a passive figure and victim. On the contrary, Rabbi Schneerson's life story is representative of the proactive and clandestine role that Hasidim played in Tsarist and Soviet Russia. He brought this experience of resistance to Vichy France and succeeded in inserting himself in the nexus of relief activity in Vichy and in saving Jewish children. And as a result of this study, we have a better understanding of Vichy at the local level and the real constraints that Jewish organizations faced in Vichy France. Thank you.
I just want to announce the order of speakers is a little different than appeared on the handout. And our next presenter will be George Weill, who has come from France. George Weill was the former Inspector General of the Archives de France and the former Conservateur of the Bibliothèque of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. That's why he's been the expert on the Alliance. He's written many books and articles on French Jewish history. Among his most recent works are Emancipation et Progrès, l'Alliance Israélite Universelle et les droits de l'homme, which came out in 2000. He's also co-authored with Roland Lardinot, Sylvain Lévy, Le Savant et le Citoyen, which is a collection of Sylvain Lévy's letters to Jean-Richard Bloch and Jacques Bigart of the Alliance, and that appeared in 2010. And most recently, he is co-authoring with Kati Hazan a book entitled Andrée Zalman, Une femme de lumière, which is appearing imminently, I think in a few weeks or maybe in a week. He told me that he himself, too, was hidden by the organization Osée in a Catholic school in southern France in 1943 and 1944. And just on a personal note, I would like to add that George Weill has been a wonderful friend to those of us in French Jewish history who've gone to France over the years, just in terms of indicating resources to us. Helped me get my book published in France, but I think he's helped all of the French Jewish historians who've gone to Paris. So again, we're very grateful and we're very happy that you've come to the U.S. For this talk. Thank you. I forgot to give the title, Organiser la clandestinité, le rôle d'Andrée Zalman dans le sauvetage des enfants au sein du service social Osée.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
Speak in the microphone.
I shall begin in English, but just for a few words. I have a solution to the Yad Vashem problem, and this is a story. It's a Jewish story, and it's a rabbi story. You know, during the war, there was a Alsatian rabbi in Limoges who was the head of the community, and his name was Abraham Deutsch, and he was a great resistant. But one day he was arrested by the milice, but he escaped with the help of the Maquis. And he walked in the country, and at night he found a farm, and he asked the farmer if he can sleep with the cattle in on the house, and the man answered, certainly yes, why not? And the rabbi said, but you know, I'm a Jew, and you take risk to have a Jew at home. And the man said, well, no matter you are a Jew or a Spanish, the important thing is you are a good Christian. Oui, dans cet exposé, je me propose de retracer le parcours d'Andrée Salomon, de ma tante Andrée Salomon, qui fut précisément une de ces combattantes de l'ombre, une de ces combattantes non violentes dont on a parlé hier et aujourd'hui. D'abord en Alsace contre la montée du nazisme, et puis au sein de l'OSE pendant la guerre. Je m'appuierai sur plusieurs séries de documents, mais en particulier des entretiens qu'elle a accordés dans les années 60-70 à l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem. Je m'appuierai aussi sur le témoignage de ses assistantes. On en a cité une d'ailleurs ce matin, c'est vous qui l'avez citée, Yvette Samuel, très jeune fille qui entra au service de l'OSE. Et le témoignage des enfants, bien sûr, on en a beaucoup. Et sur mes souvenirs personnels, si vous le permettez. Je voudrais essayer de montrer comment ces témoignages peuvent apporter un éclairage nouveau sur la participation de l'OSE dans le sauvetage des enfants et sur le fonctionnement de la résistance juive. Bien entendu, Cathy Aslan et moi, dont Vicki vient de parler, nous avons publié ces témoignages et ces mémoires d'Andrée Salomon. Le livre a connu quelques avatars, quelques problèmes, quelques Soros, mais nous espérons qu'à mon retour, il sera pareil. Andrée Salomon avait toujours refusé de parler de ce qu'elle avait accompli pendant la guerre, parce que son mari et elle-même considéraient qu'ils n'avaient fait que leur devoir de français et de juif. Ils avaient refusé les emergency visas, dont on a beaucoup parlé avec hier et ce matin, puis les faux passeports haïtiens et salvadoriens, et même les visas de personnes non refoulables accordés par le gouvernement suisse à un nombre très limité de personnalités juives, vous savez, recherchées par la Gestapo. 25 ans après la libération, Andrée Salomon refusait encore obstinément de recevoir une décoration. Elle était née en 1908 à Grussenheim, un village de 1000 habitants, dans une famille juive alsacienne de 6 enfants. On la taquinait parce qu'elle avait les yeux noirs et un air de défi qui la faisait ressembler à une gitane. On disait « Du bist vom Barber runtergefallen ». Tu es tombé de la roulotte. Tu n'es pas une vraie alsacienne. À l'âge de 17 ans, elle a gagné sa vie. Elle devint la secrétaire d'un avocat strasbourgeois, maître Fonlu, qui deviendra en 1941 le futur défenseur de Pierre Mendès France lors de son procès du Clermont en 1941. Mais Andrée Salomon s'est engagée très jeune dans toutes les causes juives importantes de l'époque. Elle fut l'une des fondatrices des éclaireurs et éclaireuses israélites de France avec Robert Gamson et un groupe d'amis très connus également pour leur participation à la résistance. Elle a milité dans le mouvement sioniste Hatikva, où elle rencontra son mari Toby Salomon, un ingénieur d'origine polonaise qui la séduisit par son flegme, sa pipe et sa moustache. Je tiens cette définition de lui-même. Devenue Andrée Salomon, elle adhéra à l'association des femmes sionistes alsaciennes, le Galéi, qui rejoindra la Réseau, dont elle deviendra l'une des vice-présidentes après la guerre. Elle fut également déléguée du Palästineramt, le bureau palestinien, dont elle prépara les Hacharot, les séminaires agricoles, et les dossiers d'immigration des jeunes pionniers allemands, les Chalutzim, passés par l'Alsace, et qu'elle envoyait, que les sionistes alsaciens envoyaient soit par le circuit officiel de la ASM, soit par les réseaux clandestins de la zone juive, à cause bien entendu du livre blanc anglais. Ce total engagement sioniste guidera toute la vie d'Andrée et Toby Salomon, mais leur départ en Israël ne pourra se réaliser qu'en 1970. À partir de 1935, elle participa aux travaux des associations créées par la Caisse de bienfaisance israélite, la Caisse centrale de l'Est est l'œuvre d'aide sociale israélite que tous les historiens de la résistance connaissent bien pour le rôle qu'elle a joué en zone sud. Sa première participation au sauvetage des enfants date de la Kristallnacht, en novembre 1938. Une photo célèbre la montre souriante au milieu de petites filles dans le jardin d'une maison d'enfants dans un village des Vosges où elles avaient été recueillies. Quant aux garçons, l'un des garçons accueillis par elle en gare de Strasbourg à cette époque raconte qu'il avait été impressionné par son aisance à parler de l'allemand au Yiddish Deutsch, au judéo-alsacien, et au français. Une facilité qui se révéla d'ailleurs pour tous les juifs alsaciens un atout précieux dans la résistance. Il ajouta qu'elle semblait sourire avec les yeux. En juin 1940, elle lui fit remettre une partie du trésor de la Réseau de Strasbourg. Il passa avec sa petite sœur en Espagne, puis au Portugal, avant de s'embarquer comme passager clandestin pour les États-Unis, où ils furent tous deux accueillis comme des héros. Je voudrais, moi aussi je cherche un éditeur, je voudrais publier le journal de Rosenstock, qui vit actuellement en Israël, et qui a écrit d'abord en allemand le récit de sa vie à Francfort, à l'époque nazie, et puis le récit de sa fuite, véritablement rocambolesque, jusqu'à son arrivée aux États-Unis. J'ai souhaité consacrer ces précieuses minutes pour insister sur des engagements de jeunesse d'Andrée Salomon, parce qu'elle a pu s'appuyer pendant toute sa vie sur les relations qu'elle avait rencontrées en Alsace, à Paris, en province ou en Israël. Elle avait une sorte de don pour trouver toujours la bonne personne, prête à lui porter aide, secours et conseils. Enfin, les conseils, elle les écoutait, mais elle ne les suivait pas toujours. Dans les situations les plus difficiles. Ce fut d'ailleurs l'un des facteurs de sa réussite, la possibilité de trouver la bonne personne au bon endroit pour faire le travail qu'elle lui demandait. En 1940, elle fut nommée chef du service social de Lozé et responsable des équipes d'assistantes placées dans les camps du Burs et de Rivesaltes. Ces assistantes devaient nourrir les internés, soigner les malades, s'occuper des enfants et les faire sortir des camps pour les accueillir dans les familles ou dans les maisons de Lozé. Le docteur Joseph Weill, l'un des hommes, j'aurais aimé que vous le citiez, parce que ce fut lui l'âme de la résistance de Lozé. L'un des hommes les plus clairvoyants de la résistance juive, a décrit dès 1941 les horreurs des camps et les énormes difficultés que les jeunes assistantes devaient affronter. Vous êtes, leur dit-il, exactement au même niveau que les gens que vous aidez. Demain, vous pourrez être à la même place. C'est votre propre misère que vous combattez. Andrée raconte sa première arrivée à Gurs. J'allais à pied, mais quand j'y traversais tous les barrages, ainsi que la longue avenue de 2 kilomètres, le petit pot de chambre que j'avais fixé en haut de mon sac à dos devint un risible jouet, devant la boue des chemins, le manque d'eau, l'état des latrines, les enfants gisant sur des paillasses souillées et les vieillards à demi morts de faim. Toutes ces assistantes décrivent son énergie infatigable pour tenir tête aux autorités des camps ou diriger leur travail dans des conditions parfois dramatiques. Comme on me l'a raconté la semaine dernière, une des assistantes, renversée par mégarde un seau de la bouillie qui avait été faite avec du lait, du riz et du fromage suisse, pouvait priver les enfants de nourriture pendant toute une journée. Paula Caron, une autre des enfants sauvés de Rivesaltes en 1942 par Andrée Salomon, raconte dans son livre, qui vient de paraître, Une enfance juive, qu'elle a d'ailleurs dédié à Andrée Salomon, l'îlot de la déportation, l'îlot K, une série de baraques délabrées dans une étendue immense, balayées l'hiver par le vent des Pyrénées et sans un brin d'ombre sous le feu du soleil de midi. Les photos d'hier montrent suffisamment comment était situé le camp de Rivesaltes. Mais quand Frau Salomon arrivait devant une baraque, tout semblait résolu d'avance. Elle savait analyser les problèmes en quelques instants et trouver toujours une solution. Elle dirigea la libération progressive des enfants de Burs, de Rivesaltes et des Milles. Elle organisa les démarches pour obtenir le fameux certificat de résidence pour placer les enfants hors des camps dans les maisons de Lozé. Elle prépara les dossiers individuels des enfants autorisés à émigrer aux États-Unis. Après de longues démarches auprès de la RSM et des Quakers, les deux organismes qui appliquaient les règlements avec une certaine rigueur et avec qui ces rapports furent parfois tendus. Nous avons ici Norbert, je ne sais pas si vous êtes parti en 1942, non, après la guerre. Après la guerre. Deux organismes. Sur les 1000 visas obtenus par Eleanor Roosevelt, Lozé ne parvint à faire partir que 320 enfants en raison des ordres de Laval de ne pas séparer les familles. Il fallait aussi persuader les mères de confier leurs enfants à des inconnus. Sur les nombreux incidents, toujours pathétiques, qui accompagnèrent ces séparations, l'une des assistantes d'Andrée, Ruth Lambert, raconte la scène déchirante survenue à la gare de Pau entre les parents descendus du Gurs pour revoir les enfants en partance pour l'Espagne et les États-Unis. Les enfants ne reconnaissaient plus les parents. Ils avaient oublié leur langue paternelle, l'allemand, et ne parlaient plus que le français. Tout le monde pleurait, même les gendarmes. Pour voir un gendarme français pleurer. Elle cite aussi l'étonnement d'un petit garçon de 4 ans qu'elle avait emmené dans un hôtel et qui s'exclama, lui qui ne connaissait que la boue des camps et les paillasses, « Ist das eine schöne Baracke ?» Quelle belle baraque. André Salomon confirme que le travail de Lozé n'a pu se faire qu'avec l'aide des organisations charitables comme la CIMAD, la Croix-Rouge suisse, les Quakers, les Unitariens et l'IMCA, mais surtout grâce au Joy, dont on a beaucoup parlé. Il s'établissait, dit-elle, une espèce de fraternité immédiate avec les Juifs d'Amérique, qui apportaient leur aide matérielle. Et elle ajoute, « Je pouvais accepter l'idée de ne pas manger moi-même ou de ne pas payer les assistantes, mais ne pas assurer le paiement des pensions à des non-juifs, ça, jamais. » Un jour, l'argent envoyé par la Suisse n'arriva pas. Elle emprunta 1 million de francs à un banquier juif alsacien qu'elle connaissait, et celui-ci les accorda sans poser aucune question. À l'été 1942, environ 1500 enfants de moins de 15 ans avaient pu être placés dans les maisons de Lozé, mais vous l'avez dit René ce matin. Les maisons de Lozé étaient toutes surveillées par les gendarmes. On a retrouvé dans leurs archives le texte des conversations téléphoniques d'André avec les directeurs de maisons d'enfants. André Salomon consacre de longs passages de ses entretiens aux déportations de Rivesaltes. Elle explique comment elle organisa la résistance aux ordres. Elle refusa de donner les adresses des enfants et entraîna toutes les organisations catholiques et protestantes à suivre son exemple, à la grande fureur des autorités du camp. Elle leur déclara « Mettre des enfants seuls dans des trains, on sait quand ils partiront, on sait bien qu'ils n'arriveront jamais. » Elle tricha avec l'âge des enfants, facilita plusieurs évasions et forma ses assistants à utiliser au maximum les exceptions prévues par la réglementation de Vichy. Elle exerça un chantage moral dont elle eut ensuite un peu honte. Elle essaya d'obtenir, dit-elle par la pitié, ce que nous ne pouvions pas obtenir autrement. Nous avons traîné les fonctionnaires de Vichy à la baraque des enfants, où ils gisaient, sales, fatigués, apeurés sur la paille, afin qu'ils voient le crime qu'ils allaient commettre. Dora Wertzberg, que j'ai rencontrée il y a 8 jours et qui a 90 ans, se souvient qu'André partageait les conditions primitives de leur logement, le manque de nourriture, les punaises des lits et les nuits d'attente fiévreuses avant le départ des parents en déportation. L'une des principales difficultés fut d'ailleurs de faire comprendre aux parents qu'ils ne devaient pas donner les adresses des enfants, afin de leur éviter la mort certaine qui les attendait. Ce fut, dit-elle, la période la plus éprouvante. Pendant des années, j'ai été poursuivi par l'image d'une mère me tendant ses 2 enfants par la fenêtre d'un train avec un regard suppliant. Et je ne peux les prendre, et le train s'ébranle. Aucun des enfants que je n'ai pu sauver, excusez-moi, ne m'a consolé des 2 petites filles d'Orisa. Dès l'automne 1942, Joseph Weill avait été informé des massacres des Juifs en Ukraine et en Pologne. Il organisa avec Andrée Salomon le passage de Lozé à la clandestinité, tout en gardant une façade officielle à la 3e direction de l'UGIF. Le passage à l'illégalité ne s'est pas fait d'un coup, dit-elle, et personne n'a eu le sentiment de faire quelque chose de grand. Simplement, le sauvetage nécessitait la construction du maillon d'une chaîne. C'est alors que se révéla l'utilité des relations qu'elle avait forgées jusqu'à présent, et en Alsace en particulier. Éclaireurs, éclaireuses, militants sionistes, notables alsaciens, rabbins, hommes d'affaires, avocats ou commerçants. Il fallut aussi, ce ne fut pas le plus facile, persuader les membres de l'OSE que les maisons d'enfants étaient devenues des pièges mortels et qu'il fallait se séparer des enfants qu'ils adoraient. Ce ne fut pas le plus facile et les désobéissances que vous connaissez provoquèrent des drames. Avant de se réfugier en Suisse, le docteur Joseph Weill, en mars 1943, le docteur Joseph Weill créa les circuits de sauvetage de l'OSE. Mais ce fut Andrée qui en assura la coordination. Le circuit de passage en Suisse, confié à Georges Moinger, qui vient de fêter son 100e anniversaire à Paris, et dont j'ai profité pour passer en Suisse. Le circuit A, confié à Georges Garel, formé de personnes non juives qui plaçaient les enfants dans des institutions catholiques réparties dans 37 départements de la zone sud. On a vu les portraits du cardinal Saliège et de Monseigneur Théas hier. J'ai été l'un de ces enfants cachés par le circuit Garel à Bergerac, dans Dortmund. Le circuit B était dirigé par Andrée Salomon elle-même, qui fournissait les fausses identités et confiait les enfants au circuit A. Elle organisa aussi les filières clandestines vers l'Espagne avec l'organisation juive de combat, et nous avons publié aussi dans ce livre une partie du journal d'Elisabeth Hirsch, Vichy, lorsqu'elle a conduit les enfants à travers les Pyrénées jusqu'au Gaïri et les emmena ensuite en octobre 1945 en Palestine. Elle-même avait repris son nom de jeune fille, Sulzer, avec une vraie carte d'identité de l'aide catholique au maire de Saint-Étienne. Elle mena pendant plusieurs années une vie errante dans les trains, dans les gares, vous l'avez signalé tout à l'heure, dans les gares, même des hôtels louches, les cafés, les autocars, pour assurer les contacts entre les enfants et les assistants de l'OSE. J'ai gardé de ces kilomètres à travers la France l'habitude de dormir dès le départ d'un véhicule, seul moyen de récupérer les fatigues de la journée. En fait, elle a conservé cette habitude même après la guerre. Quand nous allions au cinéma, elle s'endormait dans son fauteuil immédiatement et elle se réveillait à la fin du film en me disant « Quel beau film !» Son sang-froid face au danger qu'elle affrontait tous les jours était impressionnant. Un jour de mars 1944, nous avions rendez-vous à Lyon, mais elle se trompa de terre. Ma mère commença à pleurer, persuadée qu'elle avait été arrêtée. Elle nous est apparue soudain, avec 2 heures de retard, calme, assurée, souriante, comme si elle revenait de promenade. Après la libération, elle dirigea les recherches des enfants dans les fermes, les écoles et les couvents où ils avaient été cachés, puis elle décida d'avoir un enfant après s'être tant occupée des enfants des autres. Elle reprit une vie de famille, d'abord à Strasbourg, puis à Paris. En 1970, les Salomon s'installèrent en Israël, dans le Negev, près de Beersheba, puis à Jérusalem, où Andrée mourut en 1985. Son fils Jean et ses 3 petits-enfants vivent aujourd'hui à Paris. Andrée Salomon, la jeune fille aux yeux noirs et rieurs, repose aujourd'hui à côté de son mari, au cœur du pays qu'ils avaient rêvé toute leur vie de voir renaître et refleurir. Par une exception inhabituelle, dont je m'excuse auprès de vous, parce que dans un exposé académique, les sentiments personnels n'ont pas leur place, je voudrais quand même citer un texte du docteur Joseph Weill qui résume bien sa place dans la résistance non violente aux persécutions. Andrée Salomon est entrée vivante dans la légende. Elle a rempli des pages glorieuses de l'histoire du peuple juif. Elle a donné l'exemple. Elle s'est avancée souvent seule à travers les lignes de combat. Par son action héroïque et son ascendant moral extraordinaire, elle a arraché les griffes de Vichy plusieurs milliers d'enfants, en fait 1500 environ, dont elle a accompagné un grand nombre après la guerre jusqu'à leur réinsertion dans la vie. Les enfants qu'elle a sauvés cultivent encore le souvenir de cette femme de lumière, dont la devise pourrait se résumer en une seule phrase: être au service des autres en donnant le meilleur de soi-même. Je vous remercie.
Miranda, Pollard. She was brought up in Ireland and she received her PhD from Trinity College in Dublin. In 1985, she came to here to Columbia University thanks to Robert Paxton. She came as an American Association of University Women's International Fellow, and she was still working on her dissertation on Vichy, France. In the following 4 years, she ran Columbia's Institute for Research on Women and Gender. She then became the first professor of women's studies at the University of Georgia, where she teaches now. She's author of a book, Reign of Virtue, Mobilizing Gender in Vichy, France, and also many articles. She's currently working on a larger project about Odette Abadi and the Réseau Marcel that Odette and her husband Moussa Abadi founded in Nice. We've actually heard about that a few times already. The title of her paper today is A Question of Silence, Odette Abadi, the Réseau Marcel, and the Hidden Children. Thanks, Miranda Pollard.
I'm going to try and not have my thank yous go on longer than my paper, but that could happen. I'm really honoured and privileged to be here, to be invited to be here. Harriet, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough. So stop. Shani and your team from La Maison Française, really, you've just done a fabulous job. And as I said to Harriet, I thought this was going to be a little itty-bitty thing, like more or less the four of us talking around the table. And this happened. So I'm a little bit nervous, which doesn't happen all that often. You'll forgive me this. Amongst thanks, I really do have to thank Robert Paxton. Are you still here, Bob? I'm glad you stayed so much. I'm very good. At the end of the day, it's difficult for a lot of people. What do I have to thank Robert Paxton for? Well, I was just thinking just about everything, but he really is a singular presence in the world, and particularly in the academic world. I was going to say he's actually a singular man, but I thought maybe that might be a bit, you know. Okay, we'll get into that later. So, thank all of you, but I must also say thank you to Honoraire this morning, well, for your work in your book, I said that already. Susan Zuccotti somewhere. Vicki, of course. I'd actually, I shouldn't say everybody, but Paula Schwartz is here and Rod Kedward, and I really want to say a special thank you to Paula and Liv Rod were here for their work on women in the French Resistance and oral history. They really did sort of blaze a trail very early on, which made a lot of, I don't know, it certainly inspired me in terms of thinking about how to do oral history. Very quickly, because I'm going, is there anybody here from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum? Please, people, speak up. Okay. The reason I ask is I'm probably going to do something highly illegal, and if somebody's going to sue me, I would just make the caveat right now. If they're not here, then we won't tell, right? I would like to thank Judith Cohn at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. She put me in touch with, I'll speak about Julian in a moment. And she really got me very excited about this whole project. And then I went to the Fortune of Archives at Yale, and Joanne Rudolph was absolutely marvelous there. If you don't know about the Fortune of Archives, you need to find out. Amongst people that one finds, and you know, how do you learn this stuff? How do you remember it? How do you know it? And then how do you teach it to people below the Mason-Dixon line? Or no, I really have to be careful because I need my job. It's never self-evident. Redain said this morning about being a minority, and I know there are privileged minorities, and I wasn't talking about Jews, I was talking about Protestants in Ireland. But I was brought up Anglo-Irish in Ireland, and I left Ireland because I could never be Irish enough for my feminist friends. And then I went to France, where being any kind of feminist was really not a good idea. And then, surprisingly, and then I came to the United States, and for a while I was indeed living in this sort of promised land of the Upper West Side. And life has been a downhill ever since. I don't really believe in reincarnation, but I know that when I come back, it will be to the Upper West Side. More importantly, I hope to be seen as a Jewish intellectual from the Upper West Side. Okay, so let's get on with this paper, because Vicky's given me the sign. I forgot to say thank you to filmmakers. Just do that. Okay, the most important person to thank in this story is the person who survived. And not only survived, but has made this history of the Réseau Marcel in Nice one that, you know, is not shrouded in silence, one that is spoken about, one that has been included. And in particular has brought that story, well, has disseminated that story on this side of the Atlantic and in France, and that is Julian Engel, who's here, one of the enfants cachés of the Réseau Marcel in Nice. Julian, please. Julian was kind enough to fill me in about this history and to send me on my way with lots of thoughts about things. But truly, you are one of the most gracious and worldly wise person who has lived this history and is, as far as I can understand it, completely uncontaminated by anger and rage, which Irish people don't do. So I thank you for everything, really, for your role in all of this. For those of you who haven't left the Upper West Side much, this is a portrait of France. And Nice is here. But this is stolen from the Holocaust Memorial Museum's website. They have an incredible website, especially if you're a teacher. And so I just wanted to point out Nice, but you also get to see the camps, which kind of keeps us focused on that. Can I have the next slide? On the right, Moussa Abadi, and on the left, Odette Abadi, named Rosenstock. And I would just say, these are my heroes. Can I have the next slide? All right, I'm going to put this up here, and it's, I don't know, it's opening or closing a can of worms. This is a photograph that is in the Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you put the search engine, you put Nice, this will come up. And the original photograph was published in an anti-Semitic newspaper in France, and the tab underneath said, a sight we won't have to put up with much longer. Jews in Nice on the Promenade des Anglais. Well, you know, I was horrified, and then I started thinking about all of this, and, you know, seriously, when you're not Jewish, you really have a lot of burdens to bear. And one of them is just, I'm starting this project, what do? I had to go up to Jews Code and say, sorry, but how does anybody know they're Jewish? Yeah, I'm glad you get that joke. Okay, so this was very troubling to me. I mean, what do we know? How do we know it? So, it seems like a simple question, but I've been following simple questions for quite a while, and I'm going to keep going on with that. So, talking about silence, not silence, and identity, and the power of the story, and all of that. So the first part of this, very, very quickly, is silence about Jewish identity and silence about Judaism. And I think there are certain paradoxes, but I will give you the quick facts on the Réseau Marcel in case you need them of that. Between September 1943, with the arrival of the Gestapo in the previously Italian-administered zone, and August 1944, when that area was liberated, 527 children were hidden by this rescue network, which was based in Nice. Nice has a wholly anomalous and fascinating history in this period. So this network was founded by Dr. Odette Rosenstock, later married to Moussa Abadi, and it functioned primarily with the support of the local Roman Catholic prelate, who was Monseigneur Paul Raymond. The Réseau Marcel got assistance from Ossé, the Quakers, the Joint, the Scouts, Protestant pastors Évrard and Gagné, as well as some local politically sympathetic French mayors and bureaucrats. Raymond gave both Rosenstock and Abadi false identities as lay workers for the Catholic Church, and this was absolutely essential to what they accomplished. The Réseau was known as an independent Abadi sector of the Général group, and it was named the Réseau Marcel after Moussa's clandestine name, which was Monsieur Marcel. Odette's clandestine name was Sylvie Delattre. Okay, in the course of this paper I'm going to do something that if my undergraduates do it, I kill them, which is to refer to historical people by their first name. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Moussa Abadi and Odette Rosenstock. They are my heroes and would have been if I'd known them, it would have been better, but I didn't. On the other hand, I've spoken with Julianne. I feel like I know them. They don't approve me, but I feel like I know them. So, amongst all the most poignant silences that I'm going to talk about and refer to, of course, the most poignant silence is the disappearance of the children. And if one ever has a moment's doubt about the fact that one's doing the right thing, you know, one's subject, one's research, one's history, I think Serge Klatzfeld's book, Children of the Holocaust, the large tome which has so many photographs of children who were deported from France. You know, I just live with that. I have a photo of Odette, and I have this book on my desk, and that's all I need. I mean, because it keeps you very focused. And I don't really go for that sort of, I'm a professional historian, so I don't give way to personal, you know, feelings, I think, and then Vivian sort of overstated that in her book on the Patrimoine. But again, that may just be the Irish thing. I am motivated by the passion, and I think that makes my choices. And then I try and remember the training that I got in a very empirically driven university. If anybody reports to me, there's going to be trouble. Okay. So, the children who were hidden by this this rescue network did the same thing. We're all given new identities. This is one of the horrible silences. They were hidden, and they had to live with these silences. Odette wrote her memoir. She was arrested following denunciation and deported, and she survived Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. She came back to Nice after the war, and she and Moussa worked with Ossé until 1948 to help the children reunite with their families, or, as in the majority of cases, of course, find new homes for those whose parents would never return. And their never returning is, of course, the other big silence. After 1948, Moussa and Odette avoided all publicity about their role as rescuers and had no contact with their hidden children until the 1990s, when they both consented to give formal interviews and reconnect with the adult children who formed an association in their honor. Julianne pushed them to make the record there, to give témoignage, and that is a mitzvah, I think. Paul Raymond was declared a righteous among the nations in 1991, and I think the righteous among the nations has been well laid out today. So anyway, what's this silence I'm going on about with regard to Jews and rescue and Jewishness and silence? I should just say, I'm not in fact saying that the Réseau Marcel was not Jewish. I just want to put that right out there. What I am doing is trying to question about what exactly that is, and what are the omissions, what are the tacit understandings that we think of when we make these categories. So this brings us back to the photograph. Moussa and Odette, two people who started and organized this network, were themselves both self-identified Jews, one French, the other Syrian, but Parisian by adoption. And the more than 500 children from 6 months old to 16 years that they saved were from French, Polish, Belgian, Austrian families, Czech, Romanian. Both rescuers and rescued were being hunted down explicitly because they were Jewish, and we've talked about that a little bit, and defined as Jewish by the racist ideology, laws, and policies of both Nazi Germany and Vichy France. Indeed, the very organizations which hunted these Jewish children were named and recognized for their expertise in seeking out and removing, by violence, Jews as Jews from their homes and refuges in France. The Commissariat aux Questions Juives, the Milice, Brenner's Gestapo, the SS, and so on. In terms of Jewish history, it's important to remember the work of Angelo Donati in this area, an Italian Jewish banker, whose plan to remove a substantial portion of the Jews from the Nice area fell through. I think we have the Americans to thank for a lot of that going the wrong way. Eisenhower and, the declaration of Italy coming out of the war. And Susan Zuccotti is the person I immediately refer all those questions to. So if the rescue network was as successful as it was because it was primarily funded and assisted, although not exclusively, by Jewish organizations, the OSE in particular. Even the courageous and unique support afforded it by the local Catholic bishop, Mann, was explicitly given to Jewish children as victims of an anti-Jewish terror. This all seems pretty self-evident, right? The children in hiding were obliged to adopt non-Jewish identities to survive, but the Jewish identities of the children were held as sacrosanct by their protectors. There was no attempt at conversion or anything like that in this network, very, very carefully. Finally, in the aftermath of the war, the children whose parents did not return were placed almost exclusively, well, actually they were exclusively placed in Jewish homes in France, the US, or Palestine. So this seems like unambivalently a pretty straightforward Jewish resistance or rescue history. What I'm questioning is how we make those determinations about both chosen and imposed silences, but also chosen and imposed identities. How do we think about this? From the evidence, Moussa and Odette did not discuss their own beliefs as Jews at this time. We know that he'd been brought up in a devout family in Damascus, she in a secular assimilated French family in Paris. Neither of her parents were in any way pious. In one of the interviews with Annette Viviorca, Odette said she was a Parisian autant que je puisse être, and I think that was a really important part of her identity. She had a period of being interested in mysticism, Jewish mysticism, in her youth, when she felt, she said, truly Jewish. But she said it was a purely philosophical choice. It just made more sense than anything else. Moussa stayed closer to Judaism throughout his life, but there's no mention of either of them being marked by Judaism during the war. They do not speak of God or religious duty. Odette, in her memoirs of the camp, records events and attitudes pertaining to collective nationalist Jewish identities, the Polish women speaking Yiddish, for example, the communist ideals of the Yugoslav Jews, and so on. But in her own memoir or in interviews, Odette never mentioned being Jewish per se, nor do either of them actually mention any aspect of Jewish teaching, law, or scripture in the wartime period. Yet anti-Semitism led Odette to actively claim her Jewish identity. As required by Vichy, she registered as a Jew, but in an act of defiance. She actually chose to register, knowing the danger that was involved. And that act of defiance she described as being a part of her character. Her attitude was, if they don't want me, then I'm going to immerse myself in this identity that they're imposing on me. She also threw herself into work with Polish and Romanian Jewish community. They were, she said, her son peuple, her people, although we're not quite sure what that was. As in her days in medical school, she was very conscious of anti-Semitism and its material impact. 3/4 of the world was closed to us, she recalled. So, does anti-Semitism define Jewish identity? Well, no. But Moussa and Odette chose to resist in 1942 because they believed that they had to as human beings. And we're back to the question of what's humanitarian here. I think Mordecai's somewhere here. They said this was, and they had to do this as human beings, not necessarily as Jews. They said they couldn't stand by and just watch the procession. They had to become involved. Odette said that they were not at all prepared for the role they were about to play in managing what she says, in the words of that time, was this independent rescue network. When Musa was assailed by an Italian priest, Julio Penitenti, wishing to confess to him, describing the massacre of Jews in Russia from where he just returned, it's the priest who invokes his faith, unbuttoning his soutane and swearing on his small wooden crucifix in the face of Musa's complete disbelief of what he was saying about the SS shooting Jewish children. When Musa sees a Jewish woman being kicked to death by the milice near the Promenade des Anglais, an event that really is quite clearly a searing event that is completely cathartic in terms of him being propelled to action, Musa cries out loud at that time, my God, why hast thou forsaken us?" But his retelling of this moment rests more on the horror of seeing that 6-year-old child watching his mother's skull being crushed by the milice. A crowd of spectators standing around doing nothing. And I think this is as important as anything else when he says, "Where are you? Why have you abandoned us? Where are you when these crimes are being committed?" When Musa sought to enlist Monseigneur Raymond's help, he appealed to him on humanitarian grounds. He said, "Without you, I will not be able to save the children." Straightforward. In 1995, Musa recalled that he told Raymond, "I am a Jew. I come from one of the oldest ghettos in the world. I've come here to ask you to live your gospel as I am trying to live my Bible." And I'm still trying to figure out what sort of a challenge that was. So how do you characterize that? Musa and Odette readily agreed to Raymond's terms, that they'd bring neither hatred nor weapons to their work. This choice is not particularly explained, although we know that neither had any experience in violent conflict, armed conflict, and had decided the opportunity to join the armed, had turned down the opportunity to join the armed resistance. But their commitment to pacifism is not particularly parsed in a specific Jewish set of beliefs. In interviews, Odette refers to help from the Joint, Osé, the Quakers, the Scouts. She adds that they worked with local authorities who refused to participate in the Nazi persecution, Secours National, the Red Cross, Municipal Administration, and so on. When she speaks of her arrest and torture, she says, "The Germans thought it was deserved because I had torn hundreds of Jewish children from their grip." In this context, she actually doesn't mention her own Jewish identity, except insofar as she knows that she was 29 and a doctor who'd been fired from her job because of the Statut des Juifs. For his part, Musa looked back critically on the Jewish leadership who had not helped the Réseau Marcel's children in Nice, who had not helped save those children, and I think in a very rare moment of bitterness in 1995, he recalled that the Jewish community in Nice regarded him with a great deal of suspicion, and they really weren't interested in helping him save children, but just looking after each other's situation. Musa remembers how Nice was bourrée de Juifs. Despite the lack of jobs, many Jews had fled there. We think of 25 to 30,000 in a population of about 250,000. Odette recalled even some of her medical colleagues from Paris were there. Whatever about the French Jews who may well have visited Nice for their holidays before the war, it was Jews from Eastern Europe who actually stood out, particularly down by the Promenade des Anglais. Panicacci is the historian who's really got the comprehensive background on all of this. But for Jews hunted throughout Europe, Odette said this was their last refuge. Yet in Nice, these East European Jews were victimized by swindlers, thugs, and by denunciations. One of the reasons she said she was able to evade capture for so long was that, in her own words, she didn't look too Jewish. As for the children, there's no mention of their family beliefs or practices, before or after they are submerged in their new clandestine lives. Musa spoke of the terrible burden imposed by stealing a child's identity, this term he uses, as part of the process of depersonalization. But of all the aspects of the new lives of the hidden children which are remarked upon and recorded by the Abadi, the names of children, ages, health status, personality traits, and so on, no comment is made about a loss of or need for things Jewish. Now, in many ways, this is to be expected. I mean, all of this was dangerous information to be gathering at all. And after all, these children had lost their parents, their homes, their names, their friends, everything. Yet I found no comment about cultural and religious losses, I don't know, books, diet, rituals, prayers, anything, that sort of attached, if you like, Jewishness, Jewish losses to these children. Some of the children, the older ones, expressed their fears about being lost forever in their new names and disguises, and they commented upon the worry of not knowing Roman Catholic prayers, for example. But we don't have any sense of whether even the older children missed any particular aspect of their Jewish identity, social, cultural, religious. Not brought up as a secular Jew, was Musa more committed to Judaism? Later in life, Odette and Musa were married by a rabbi. Their funeral services were also conducted by a rabbi. Musa left his prayer book to a survivor, the husband of one of the Marcel children, with a request to say Kaddish for him. Odette, as far as I know, did not make similar arrangements, and she had not become involved in Jewish life per se. Only one that I know of was troubled by Odette's suicide at the end of her life after Musa's death. She committed suicide as an act that was contrary to Jewish beliefs, and by her burial by a rabbi in the Jewish section of Montparnasse Cemetery. And I really, I would like to invite you all to go to that place in their memory. So, this is going to be the quickest 5 minutes. Yeah. Musa, in a 1995 speech, said, and I think this evokes the spiritual grief, if I knew how to pray, I would pray night and day for the children, your children, that will never know the outcome, the consequences, the tragic fate of these children who were denounced to particular children, the children that were massacred. But since that time, in terms of praying, I've not been on very good terms with God. So there are important silences that I just want to underline. I think I would just say that, as far as I'm concerned, part of our obligation is not to draw a line about how Jewish, who Jewish, when Jewish, but to actually, I think we're obliged to respect the ambiguity in their identities, in their work, and in their own chosen lives. Very, very quickly. Yes? I wanted to bring up the next contentious question, well, one, which is gender. Oh, I keep doing this, don't I? All right. 2 questions to raise. Has Odette's part in the history of the Réseau Marcel been recognized and articulated as equal to Musa's? Well, we had an example this morning of how it has not, so that was perfect. Thank you very much. The second question, which I think is a little bit more interesting, is in what ways have the historical narratives of this, the historical narratives of this network relied on traditional gender discourses? How does that all get written? Odette Abadi was the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered. In her memoir and on screen, in the interviews she did with Annette Vivioka, she's not just passionate and elegant and self-confident and articulate, she conveys a sort of searing truthfulness. She speaks on the page and to the camera as an implacable witness, more a prophet than a victim. Odette survived torture by the Gestapo, deportation, and the unique barbarism invented by Nazis in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. All this, and she kept her integrity. In her post-war chosen career as a public health doctor and administrator, she earned the highest honors, and in her personal life, she showed an unwavering devotion to Musa, the very model of an authentic, lifelong love. Odette was someone who was as tough, risk-taking, uncompromising, decisive, intellectually gifted. Do you think I'm a bit of a fan? Physically rigid, resilient, and as morally sure-footed as any man. So, what do we make of this? Her apparent lifelong deference to Musa, her acceptance of a role in his shadows in the historical narrative of the Réseau Marcel, and in her later professional life. I want to set aside any sort of personality thing about Musa's character because it has variously been described to me as difficult and overbearing, and I don't want to go there. But I do want to question why an independent spirit such as Odette's would embrace the role of secretary and companion to the great man. Instead, I'd like to focus on the history of the Réseau Marcel, in which she seemed to accept and co-construct a narrative that foregrounded his leadership. She chose that, and there's some silences around it. In several early accounts, Musa is recognized as the sole founder of this network. After all, the rescue network is named after the man in the trench coat, who was Musa, Monsieur Marcel. And as he apparently had a relationship with Osé and the Joint, and who first approached Monsignor Raymond and won his support, the sine qua non of the Réseau's success. So no silence there. But what is noticeable, and is never explicitly spoken about as far as I know, and Julian would correct me, is that the very nature and advocacy, as far as I'm concerned, the very origins of the Réseau, were in fact due to Odette Rosenstock. Perhaps enough so that this Réseau, this is my big suggestion of the day, but I don't have an institution behind me to make this happen, that the Réseau should be renamed. The Réseau Sylvie et Marcel, and I think that would work a lot better and be more historically accurate after both their aliases. So my question is more than just an attempt to revise the record in ways that might suit contemporary feminist predilections, my own included, and I think a renaming that Odette would herself have viscerally rejected. So let me lay out the historical evidence even faster than I'm doing right at the moment. Despite Odette's claim that she and Moussa were unprepared for what they did, it is clear that Odette herself had an activist background. Not only did she attend left-wing meetings and rallies in Paris in the 1930s, she left her medical school studies to aid refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and this wasn't any charity expedition to Perpignan to go to the camps. She in fact assisted the escape of many refugees from the internment camps we learned about last night, particularly Rivesaltes. So she was engaged in clandestine illegal work before 1940 when she was fired from a public sector job for being Jewish. After the French defeat in the summer of 1940, Moussa cycled to see her in Montargis where she was working, and then he went on his way via Vichy to Nice. Odette stayed in German-occupied Paris and worked in Jewish dispensaries with foreign Jewish refugees. It was not until November 1941 that she illegally crossed the demarcation line to join Moussa in Nice. Once there, she found him in bad shape and set about selling some of her possessions, including her accordion, to help get him back on his feet. While we know that he had contact with Gustave Cohn, and also tried to get an American, he had also tried to get an American exit visa, it was Odette's attempts to find employment about which we know the most, along with her work with Jewish clinics and welfare offices in Nice. During this time, we also know that she learned of her mother and sister's arrest for trying to cross the demarcation line without papers. They did not return from Auschwitz. In the story of the Réseau creation, two events are always mentioned. Moussa's meeting with Don Penitenti, the Italian priest I just mentioned, and his witnessing of this horrific murder of the young Jewish woman near the prom. While acknowledging that these were key moments pushing Moussa and Odette to the decision to do something, to no longer just watch events, I think it's important to retrace Odette's probable influence in their decision, and that is the silence that does not get talked about. They could have chosen many forms of resistance to Nazism. After all, Moussa was a graduate student at the Sorbonne in medieval studies, and had been a successful actor, had traveled to New York with his theatre company, had contacts abroad, and his mentor, Gustave Cohn, was leading for the US. So, why children's rescue? Another silence. Odette's experience is missing from the story of that conversion to action. She had been an activist, she graduated as a doctor, got various school appointments in the Paris region, dealing with children. Most poignantly, Odette had written her medical thesis on toys and children's play. In Nice, she worked with the clinics where the welfare of children was of paramount importance. Everything she did, I think, can equally point to her logical choice of children's rescue over other forms of resistance. Let's not forget that in agreeing not to use weapons and violence in their struggle, Odette was also acting in perfect conformity with her oath as a doctor. After the decision was made to rescue Jewish children threatened by deportation, Moussa and Odette divided their work in what we might think of as the stereotypical masculine-feminine division of labor. To be crude, he worked at the office, organizing funding, ID cards, liaising with the bishop, and other key contacts. She gathered up the orphan children, brought them to the villa in Simiez for depersonalization, by Moussa would seem, and then she delivered the children to their new home locations where she later visited them and oversaw their welfare from September 1943 until her arrest in April 1944. Well, okay, how does speaking rather than maintaining these silences matter in the overall history of Jewish resistance to Nazism in France, which is what we're here for? 4 ways. It changes the network's central creation mythology. It shifts the scales in any assessment of women in Jewish rescue and resistance, and I like to follow up on René saying Jewish resistance. It is French resistance. It also reveals how both Odette and Moussa's own narrative was chosen to highlight his actions, not hers. And finally, it invites us to reconsider the complexity of gender, I think, and Jewish rescue resistance activities, and there's always going to be more work needed to be done on that, and soon. Moussa recognized that no one could have done what Odette did. Yet what she did was subsumed into his narrative, the story of Monsieur Marcel, not Sylvie Delat. For example, every account refers to him, his relationship with Raymond, his counterfeiting and documentary skills, his being on the run. But it was Odette who crisscrossed the region, not just Nice, bringing the children to safety, changing their hiding places, looking after their individual needs. What for sociologists constitutes as doing the emotional labor of the family. She is even the one who traveled at all hours to find clothing and food, no easy matter in the Nice region, at all, and presumably, although it's not recorded, to make sure that Musa stayed in good health. I mean, she loved him, she worked, this was part of what was going on. I am not in any way trying to diminish, I should say this very clearly, Musa's role in all of this. He traveled to Paris, he took risks, he risked his life every day on the street and in the bishop's office. When Odette was arrested, the burden they had shared fell on his shoulders. He didn't hesitate in continuing alone. Skipping along. It seems to me that it's really imperative to go back, though, and to look and see what Odette did and how that might change the story. As far as I'm concerned, we said nothing else, and I've dealt with this in work elsewhere about soundscape and Odette's. My book is going to be about Odette, in case that didn't become clear. She, when she was arrested, was taken by the Gestapo and tortured over an 8-day period. And she doesn't want to talk about that, she doesn't. And you respect, it's a reviolation, but, you know, I think if we just take that fact, she gave no information about the children's whereabouts. She did not give them anything. When she was transferred from Drancy to Auschwitz-Birkenau on the train, she decided to take care of the children. She really took a sort of leadership role. You know, told people how to behave, shut up, not be so selfish. In the midst of absolute misery, a catastrophe, she really took all sorts of extraordinary responsibilities, and she really worked throughout the period of being in the death camps to the very limits of her existence. She nearly died of typhus at Bergen-Belsen. Okay, very last bit. She returned to Nice in 1945. She took up the work with Musa again at his side. She did more than survive. I think she was an exceptional person, and I'm not going to say she was an exceptional woman. Over the last decades, feminist historians have documented multiple ways in which women experienced and resisted the Shoah, in ways that were distinct from men's, without in any sense devaluing the courage or suffering of Jewish men. Odette fought back against her enemy as actively as any man could have done, and she succeeded in this struggle as a woman, a doctor, and a French Jew. She both embraced and transcended her gender. She worked in ways that Musa could not, and she succeeded in ways that Musa could not. And then, having survived the impossible, Odette took a secondary part in the drama and history that was Réseau, the Réseau's post-liberation life. Between 1945 and 1948, she was there in Nice with him, largely anonymous. After 1948, something I think fairly extraordinary happened, which is Musa and Odette really completely avoided to shoot any contact with the children and any publicity. And this is a sort of extraordinary silence. They were very, very modest, and they were very dedicated to not taking any plaudits for anything that they had done. Musa Abadi is regarded as one of the great theatre critics of the 20th century in France, and I am going to say just quite blankly, and Julian may fit at this, I believe that Musa's cultural legacy was due to Odette. It's what she did. Not only was she the emotional pillar of his existence, she was the person who transcribed and typed up every night the notes of the plays that they both attended, giving him his material for radio, stop it, and allowing him to amass a unique archive to seal his legacy, in her words, to French civilization. She had a full-time job, it seems to me, as his secretary, and a full-time job as a public health doctor. Yet the question of silence in this gender analysis is not simple. Odette Abadi was no dupe, no victim to patriarchy, no acquiescent female. Musa didn't manipulate her into serving his every need in their married life, any more than he dragged her into a resistance movement that he alone had initiated in 1942. From the moment they met, Odette chose her destiny. She chose to love this man, and she chose to be the actor who showed her co-star in the very best light. She lived her life with a unique fierceness, concealed under the most feminine of guises. She was beautiful, petite, charming. I fell in love with her when I saw her in this interview. She was completely la Parisienne. But she was always Musa's equal. She embraced silence, but she was not silenced. Thank you very much.
I hope you'll indulge me, but I hope you'll indulge me to just take 10 more minutes. I'm sorry, I know all of you have been so sick. As a result of these initiatives, by mid-April of 1942, there were only 55 Jewish children left at this camp of Réseau. There was a women's section there with over children. Originally, there had been over 500 children there the previous winter. One Jose official went so far as to report that, quote, the problem of children in the camps can now be considered virtually resolved, end quote. It's true, as we now know, that these children were released from one hell into another one, since these Jewish residential homes were ultimately targeted by the Gestapo and the milice. But there was some time before those raids began, and during that period of relative calm before the storm, these children regarded their new homes as a sort of paradise. To cite the testimony of one of Susan Zuccotti's witnesses from her book, Holocaust Odysseys. Yet, as Jewish life became more precarious in 1943 through 44, Jewish organizations did turn to clandestine operations. According to Andrée Zalman, the passage from a legal to a clandestine existence was not as abrupt as people later thought. As she said, and here I'm actually just quoting what the quote that George Weill presented, the passage into illegality was not accomplished in a single blow, and no one felt that they were undertaking anything momentous. Rescue simply necessitated the construction of links of a chain. Nevertheless, the move toward an underground existence, that is a stance which entailed a stance of open resistance to the Vichy regime, did require a shift of thinking. And it may well be that by 1943 through 44, disbanding Jewish organizations altogether might well have been the best strategy. Still, as I think all these papers suggest, the aim of Jewish organizations was not only to save Jews as individuals, but to save Judaism. Indeed, this is the major reason why there was such great resistance to the idea of dispersing these children among Christian institutions or among families. Harriet Jackson speculates that Rabbi Schneerson avoided this alternative because of his orthodoxy. Actually, she didn't really get to talk much about that. But that was the reason that these children were still in this home at this late date. But I actually think this hesitancy was shared by all the Jewish relief and rescue organizations, even though they may have defined Judaism quite differently. As one Jose worker put it, the rationale for keeping Jewish children in Jewish homes was to, quote, ensure a better education for the children and to give them a feeling of belonging to a group and of being bound to one another by ties of solidarity, end quote. And this factor, together with the practical problems involved with dispersing the children, was the major reason why some of these homes continued to exist even into 1944, despite the fact that it's probably true Jewish leaders should have known that it would have been better at this point to have just made sure that those children had been dispersed. Although again, as Harriet raises this point, Schneerson was just about, even these children in this home were about to be sent to Switzerland. I just want to build on Miranda Pollard's notion of silences to raise a few points for us to think about as possible avenues for future research, especially if we have any graduate students here in the audience. One is a topic that's come up on multiple occasions today, the role of women. All three of these papers have focused to some extent on Jewish women: Andrée Zalman, Odette Abadi, Sarah and Hadassah Schneerson, who actually, one could raise the same question about them as Miranda did in her paper. But all of them were activist social workers, and I would argue or suggest that the role of Jewish women as social workers, both before and during the war, is an issue that remains relatively unexplored. Marian Kaplan, I'm not sure if she's still here, has done some of this work for Germany, but I'm not aware of it. Maybe, again, other people here may be more aware of some recent work on this topic. At the same time, we need to think about the role of women social workers more broadly, since Catholic and Protestant women, too, played a huge role in the rescue of Jewish children. Women like Germaine Rivière, a close affiliate of Cardinal Gerliers in southwestern France, Madeleine Barrault, whom we saw quite a bit of last night in the film clips that Pierre Sauvage presented to us, but she was the indefatigable leader of the CIMAD, the Protestant Relief Organization. All these women were critical in providing relief in the camps and ultimately arranging the escape of Jewish children to Switzerland. So again, I think this role of women in general as social workers is somewhat of an understudied topic in looking at rescue and resistance. A second silence mentioned by Miranda Pollard is religion. Harriet Jackson has suggested that we don't really know a great deal about Jewish religious life under Vichy, yet in the papers of the Conservateur Central that have become available in recent years, there's rich material on the role of the rabbinate and chaplains. Individuals like Grand Rabbi René Hirschler and a lay leader, but prominent figure, the writer Edmund Flegg, who served as one of the leaders of the Scout movement, worked arduously to keep Jewish religious life alive under these trying circumstances. Third, although all three of these papers are about Jewish rescue, each of them highlights the degree to which Jewish rescue would not have been possible without the help of Christians, both Catholics and Protestants. I think Renee this morning, Renee Posnansky mentioned how you can't really separate these two resistance movements. Miranda Pollard points to help from the Archbishop of Nice, Monsignor Raymond, who had been an ardent supporter of Vichy, but who increasingly became disenchanted in part because of the roundups of Jews. But again, as we've heard in a number of papers here today, a large number of Christians played a critical role in Jewish rescue. Again, from Pierre Sauvage's film clips, we've already heard about the activities of Père Chalet, Abbé Blasberg, Monsignor Gerlier, Monsignor Saliège, Pierre-Marie Benoit, whom Susan Zuccotti talked about, and again, Germaine Rivière, whom we didn't hear much about, but she was mentioned in some of the film clips as well. And then among Protestants, Pastor Bergner, Pastor Trocme, Pastor Turrell, and then Donald Lowry, Americans as well, the head of the YMCA, and actually Pierre Sauvage also mentioned Quaker organizations. All of these individuals and the organizations they represented, the Amitié Chrétienne, CIMAD, the Quakers, they all experienced the same transformation of going from a legal to a clandestine existence during this paper, a legal existence of helping the internees in the camps, to increasingly giving false papers and ultimately helping to ferret the refugees, and especially children, into Switzerland. I think what's important here is that despite the fact that Vichy was a period of unprecedented anti-Semitism, it was also a period of unprecedented interfaith cooperation. We've seen this, I think, across the board, but this interfaith cooperation, especially between Jews and Christians, had far-reaching consequences for the post-war period in terms of fostering interfaith dialogue. Finally, one last silence that George Weill pointed to is the Alsatian connection. I can't help but mention this since I've also worked on the history of Alsatian Jews. But according to George Weill, Andrée Salomon's strong sense of Jewish peoplehood was shaped in large measure by her Alsatian background and especially her sympathy for Zionism. And I think that's true of Grand Rabbi René Hirschler as well. Throughout the 1930s, Alsatian Jewish leaders had taken a much more upfront position with regard to fighting anti-Semitism and also with regard to pressuring French Jewish organizations to take a more vigorous and generous stance toward helping their besieged refugee co-religionists who were fleeing to France from Central and Eastern Europe. It was to a large extent these leaders in groups like the Caron, the Jewish Scouts, which included a disproportionate number of Alsatian Jews, that helped to sustain what Andrée Salomon called the spiritual resistance under Vichy. Thank you very much. And to take questions.
Actually, I happen to be one of the Abadi's children.
What?
Yes. It is very important to talk about Odette, but I have to tell you that I grew up knowing as much about Odette as about Musa. So it's, I don't know where the research comes from, probably, but there's another side that I always heard about Odette, and also from the people I knew. I also happen to know a French woman who was the Denis Mantou, who was during the war, and who was in the underground, and she also always talked about Odette. So it's not as clear-cut. And I also wanted to say, I don't know if you're aware of it, but in Paris there's now a park under the name of Musa and Odette.
Yeah.
And I was always told about Odette's courage and the fact she was in a concentration camp and she came back. And so I have such an awe, so I was a little surprised by
So you'll agree with me in petition and change the Réseau name to.
I just think that both have to, and also the issue of religion, I didn't totally understand. I mean, I was first of all I was taken to the convent by Uncle Musa, which is not by her. That was in 43 before she went to the camp. And also I was converted first Catholic and then Protestant. I'm an expert in religion. So it's complicated. It's just not just one way or black or white. That's really what I want. So it doesn't, and I also feel that it's very, very important not to forget the bishop role, because without him we could have done nothing. And
Thank you very much.
I wanted to thank you all for those papers, and especially the issues that Miranda raised. I actually think that the whole complex thing it's about time that it got articulated in academic or whatever general circles. I think it's not so much the fact of the woman, because then you get into this problem who's mentioned more, but the kinds of questions that were raised by that. And I just wanted to say two things about that. One is that the Clarksville book is what inspired me to have my colloquium, the pictures of the children. I have my own pictures on my desk of certain of the children. We all choose them. And Susan Sikochi's book has this the dedication. The first thing you read is about the children who were held in the Veldiv and deported. So you can't avoid that aspect of it once you start studying it. But the other thing is there are other women. The focus on the Klaus Barbie trial has to do with Zalman and all that kind of thing. But it's two mothers of these youth who found Barbie in Bolivia, Ita Rosa Brenner and Fortune Ben-Bibi. And there's tons of stuff on them that needs to be made articulated. There's the children of these youth, the whole 4-hour film by with Ophil's Hotel News, but it starts and ends with the children of these youth, and that has to do with women's work.
I just like to say that one thing that's come out of this conference for me, it kind of opened my eyes to a point, which is that one of the reasons that Jewish rescuers have not been recognized, acknowledged, described, some of the information is actually lost, is because they themselves did not want the recognition. And I had never realized that before. I found it for the first time in my work, that'll just be a second, but in my work with Joseph Bass, because Joseph Bass did not want any recognition for what he did. All right, this was the first time I'd heard that, and I clocked it up and I wrote it down, but then I hear the same thing today from Andrée Zalman and from Odette and Musa, and I wonder from how many others. But it's interesting for a number of reasons. It's interesting because it's a partial factor in the lack of recognition and the loss of information about these clandestine operations, which after all were clandestine. But it's also, I think, something we might think about in terms of the degree of psychological scarring that these people had, dealing day after day after day with the kind of work that they were doing, the kind of people they were trying to help, the kinds of tragedies that they were witnessing. I don't know why one would not want recognition. I know that Joseph Bass did receive medals for his military resistance, and he wore them very proudly. But he did not want to talk about the work he had done as a rescuer. And I, until today, thought he was the only one, and now I see that he's not.
I think there's one much more powerful reason, at least in the one country that I know, and that is when my country is still very anti-Semitic after the war, the people who have helped Jews are not really welcome and don't want other people to know about it.
Well, I'm not sure that would apply to Jewish rescuers. I mean, we mentioned that it applied either to the Arab ones or the some Christians maybe, especially like in Poland. Pardon? Yes, in Poland, that was the case. I'm not sure that it would apply to Jewish rescuers in France.
Well, I know that in Austria, for instance, there are much more people than you know who have helped Jews, and who have not made a lot of fuss about it until the beginning now. Talk about it, but for that reason.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
I was certain coming here that I would be the only one from the Réseau Marcel who could speak, having known Odette at the age of 10 when we met briefly for a few hours, the time for her to take me and my brother from Nice to Cannes. And to see her the next time, nearly 50 years later, 48 or 49 years later, when I discovered her real identity. She was initially presented to me as Sylvie Delattre, working for the Catholic Diocese of Nice, and I assumed that she was Catholic and that my being, and my brother, both of us being taken to Cannes, to the Rayon du Soleil, where we were to spend 3 years, I always assumed that this was the intervention of the church and was totally ignorant of the existence of the Réseau Marcel until I had a chance to learn all about it through a chance encounter in Jerusalem of one Lucien Lazare, the well-known French-Israeli historian who, upon hearing my story, smiled at me and he said, "This is not your history," and he proceeded to tell me about the Réseau Marcel. But it's late and it's a complex and rich story and it's getting late. I will simply say that I share Miranda's attempt to take Odette out of La Femme de l'Ombre and to put her in full light. I may not tilt the other way. I would simply say that both of them really deserve the full light of recognition and of remembrance for what they did. There is a point that escapes, I think, the history, and that has only, I think, recently come to light, that there is another person who has played a very critical role in the history of the Réseau Marcel. This person whose name has come up once or twice in the last day or so, Maurice Brenner, the representative of the joint, or one of perhaps several representatives of the joint, who met Moussa in June or July 1942. I should say the two of them were friends. They had known each other at the Sorbonne in the late 30s. Moussa was seized by all of the experiences that Miranda cited and many others, the Promenade des Anglais incident, the tale brought by the aumônier Italien from the Russian front. But he was full of anger, he was full of despair, but he didn't really know what to do about it. He felt it was something that he and Odette should react and do something about. He really didn't have an idea of what. And it is Maurice Brenner, who is sort of the Scarlet Pimpernel, who I think deserves a history of his own, who told Moussa in this chance meeting that occurred in about June or July 1942 about le Réseau Garel and what was being done and had been done by him and his many associates in the preceding 6 or 12 months, namely the sauvetage des enfants, and who recounted the experience of Général in dealing with the Catholic Church and enlisting all the eminent Catholics that he did, évêques et later cardinaux, and who inspired Moussa to undertake a similar effort in Nice. And furthermore, he engineered a meeting of Général and Moussa that occurred in probably August of 1942, in which, in the course of several hours, Général fully briefed Moussa on what he had done in the preceding 12 months or so in dispersing children from the camps, from the homes that had been created for them by the Osé, and all the other measures, including spiriting children to Switzerland. So armed with this information and this example and the rather, you might say, technical assistance provided by Général, Moussa proceeded to mount his own network. And he did so, insisting at the time to Général that he had to do so on his own as an independent operator. And he was very, very strong about this, partly reflecting his personality, but partly also as a measure of security. It made no sense for him to operate under the aegis of the Réseau Général with all of the risks attendant in doing so. And the decisive fact that really wrapped the whole thing together is the assurance that Maurice Brenner could provide him that money would be forthcoming, that the funds would be available. And he was not the only beneficiary of this assurance, Général and others similarly, but the availability of financing was a critical factor in the success of this and many other enterprises that we have talked about yesterday and today.
Thank you. I actually have to say that here. I had mentioned to Renee earlier today, this issue of the financing, it's really very important because the money came, as you said, from the Joint Distribution Committee, but it was funneled primarily through the UGIF. And in the Southern Zone, the individual organizations retained a great deal of autonomy. And I think in terms of this whole question of why maybe recognizing Jews is problematic, it may be, again, that where do you draw the line? Should even Raymond Lambert, who was the head of the UGIF in the Southern Zone, be recognized as, actually, I mean, some resistors have recognized him as a resistor or somebody, and I think, it wasn't Maurice Brenner his cousin?
Yes.
Yes, I believe so. Okay, and they were very, very close. And again, I think this raises the whole question of the UGIF, which actually was not mentioned much today, but I think has to come in when we're talking about Jewish rescue, because the money came from there. Even Amitié Chrétienne was funded primarily with Jewish money. So you can't, again, you can't really separate these organizations.
Very, very quickly, I forgot to say and do something. This is the Arnold Klatsfeld and Serge Klatsfeld. It's a little boy. I don't know if you know the story. It's a very, very, it's a very poignant story. But on the Promenade des Anglais, so this is, I think, very important, touching to the whole story of rescue in Nice. Arnold, really gave his life to save his wife and children. Could I have the next photo? I don't know if you recognize this. This is Julien Angel. Angel was the hidden name. I think you look
My brother George.
Yeah, and your brother George. So again, it's a reminder, this is what this history is all about. And I think you look very well there. Can I see the other photo? That was before?
Us again, 3 years later, shortly before leaving the United States in mid-1946.
I'm not trying to steal the show, but just to say that we keep remembering what this is actually all about. This is the smile, and we can see the smile. This is the history.
I have a question. One always knew about these two Réseau, Général and Abadi. But actually, your comments made clear that it looks as if the Réseau Marcel was built more or less upon the knowledge of the Réseau Général.
Yes, with the big difference that the Réseau Général was composed of 20, 30, 50 people, if not more so. He had a vast array of people that he had assembled and who at one time or another worked with him closely. The Réseau Marcel was essentially based on the work of two people. And the two younger assistants provided by the OSE, who were very early in the game arrested and disappeared. I should underline as well that a very major contributor to the success of their enterprise was the contributions of l'évêque called Raymond.
But was there any further contact between the two of them after this meeting of August 42 that you mentioned, I think?
Général?
Between Général and Marcel?
Subsequently,
No.
I mean,
Yes,
it
yes.
was,
There was one meeting between Général and Moussa Abadi in wartime in 1942.
And after that, they never met?
No.
At the end of the war, yes.
But during the war?
No. So it was one briefing that he gave, and that was sufficient for Moussa to take off and proceed to organize his network.
Yes, so what I knew Garel very well. I was a child, of course, but I knew Garel because he was a very close friend of Andrée Salomon. And he didn't want to speak about his réseau, because a secret réseau is to be secret. Well, that's the logic. After the war, he wrote an article, and we know how it works. And Michel Garel, one of his sons, wrote a few years ago another article, because he found some people who helped his father. And Garel himself said he had a meeting with Moussa Abadi, and he understood that Moussa Abadi wouldn't cooperate with him. He wanted to work alone. So I don't think they met after the war.
oh, they did. They did.
I think
He
they
did
did.
never mention.
Well-
Never mentioned.
Immediately after the war, Moussa and Odette worked together to find the children, get them back to families, if not families, find new families. And then when they were doing that process, they were connected with Osé and Garel, but in 48 they handed over their organization, which had been independent absolutely up until that point. They sort of handed it back to Garel.
I must add that the meeting took place in 43 and not in 42, because Réseau Garel was constituted only in January 43, just before the departure of Joseph Weill in Switzerland.
That may be so, but the experience acquired between the beginning of 1943, January, and June or July 46 was the basis on which Garel was in a position to speak from considerable experience to someone who had, when they met, still had only the vaguest notions of what to do.
Actually, there's going to be a reception afterwards, so maybe some of this we can continue on. Excuse me for Renee, please, next.
First of all, I want to thank First of all, I want to thank the three of you. I want to thank the three of you. I think it was a very fascinating panel. As a fact, I learned a lot from your conference. It was a fascinating conference. But I'd like maybe to challenge something which has been said now, and it might be completely wrong. So I'm sorry if I'm completely wrong. But you have said, all of you have said one after the other, and then Susan has said again, that none of them wanted recognition. Okay. Maybe none of them wanted a medal. Obviously, they were modest, they thought it should be done, and wonderful persons, etc., etc., etc. I wonder if it's true that they didn't want their story to be told. And why do I wonder? Because I think that if you go to the CDJC archives, you found there testimonies of most of these people dating back 1946, 1945, 1946, 1947. Maybe not of them, maybe not, I don't know. But many of those you can find. So I wonder, and I think we are talking about a social phenomena, and not personal, or I'm trying to get from personal stories to a social phenomena. And I'm wondering why, I mean, if it's not only a question of their personal qualities or their psychological mind or something of the kind, but it's because rescue was a non-issue. Nobody would be ready to listen to them because nobody was interested about that. And the same goes, because I'm saying that because, and again, I might be wrong, but I'm saying that because the same goes on about the fact that, well, the Holocaust wasn't recognized after World War II because nobody was conscious about what had happened, and the Jews were the first who wanted to forget about it. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. If you look at what was going in France, Jews were trying to make their voice heard, they just were not heard. Nobody was ready to listen to them. So I'm wondering if the fact that they didn't look for recognition is the right way of wording that. They were not telling their story because nobody was really ready to listen to their story. Question mark.
Absolutely.
It's very true. Short, why wasn't Musa arrested?
Why wasn't he? He was very nearly arrested. He managed to escape. He lived a life really desperately on the run all the time, constantly under risk. And when she was denounced, arrested, and disappeared, he went to Paris, tried to get her. There's nothing to be done. Comes back to Nice. He literally, even with his connections, the Archbishop Raymond said to him, "Look, you know, this is disastrous. We found you a safe place outside Nice. You need to go there for a while." And he said, "Look, when you were in the First World War, in La Grande Guerre, did you leave your post?" And he said, "I'm not leaving my post." So what he had to do was in Nice, he asked for times of all the masses that were being said, and he used to go from mass to mass to mass. You know, it was a place to be, and he had to sleep on the floor of a school. I mean, it was desperate measures to avoid being picked up and arrested. I mean, you know, he kept up the work. He was, you know, luck comes into it, of course.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I completely agree with Renee. One other dimension that hasn't been mentioned is when you are deemed to have been a member of the French resistance in France, you have all sorts of benefits, all sorts of support, all sorts of subsidies that you can receive. These were not given to rescuers. And I knew Madeleine Dreyfus very well, who worked in the Réseau Garel. And I remember her telling me, trying to get some of these benefits and how difficult it was. The second thing, which was relevant to the question, is I think all the Jewish rescuers felt the weight of everything they had failed to do more than anybody else would have felt. I don't think there's a single one of them who wasn't so conscious of what they weren't able to achieve, so they weren't going to put themselves forward. And lastly, there's a characteristic that applies to all the rescuers. You show me a boastful rescuer, and I'll show you a liar.
But can I just... I'm not going to completely disagree about this, but for Moussa and Odette, and I agree, we shouldn't just make this all a question of personality, but at the same time, it's very hard to come up with some sort of independent variables that are going to work. I'm not a social scientist. But in their case, what they had both been through, and particularly for Odette, and they really were such a couple, it was too painful what they had been through. It was too painful what she had gone through in the camps. And as far as I can understand, and they both had a breakdown of sorts. So to hold their history back, it's not just a question of, well, we're very modest, we're not going to talk about that. And she, and you could go into benefits, and and he was recognized in the resistance, all of that. They very much chose to cut themselves off, and they reinvented this new life. And I think that was very, very important. It's not just a question of modesty, it was really a question of also self-protection. And I think the ethical choice for them was also, these children, when I first heard of it, how could you possibly leave the children? How could you possibly have no contact with them? What is that? But I understand far better now that they really believed this was too painful a period. These children need to be allowed to go.